Alrighty, welcome to the Beer Scholar Six Pack, where we discuss 6 quick links, topics, or current events, mostly about beer. I want to say happy Thanksgiving. You may be watching this any time of the year because it's just like on YouTube and in podcast format, but it is Thanksgiving time, and I wanted to say happy Thanksgiving to all of you. I'm truly, truly thankful to all of you for your support. I hope you're like entering a season of the year that feels like special and cozy and is full of families and loved ones and good food. But hey, if this is a season that you struggle with, as some of us do, please reach out to the people in your life and ask them if you can come hang out for Friendsgiving or, Christmas or whatever holiday you celebrate or that they celebrate. I have had great holiday seasons and real bummer holiday seasons. So I definitely know both sides of this, right? There's all the expectations and the pressure, and it's not always you putting the pressure on. Sometimes other people around you, you might have brutal travel, you might have difficult family members, who knows? And, I want to say, don't let it get to you, but sometimes that's just impossible. So, one thought I have about the holiday seasons is that sometimes you just need to simplify. You need to just do the easy thing and hang out with the people who really make you happy. For me, I wish that I could be in Florida with my parents for Thanksgiving and for Christmas, but they're literally on the opposite side of the United States. So it isn't really always an option, like financially or because of the brutal travel involved and just kind of my own mental health. So I'll be here in Portland, Oregon with my friends and some of their families. Love and miss you, Mom and Dad. They do watch. They do listen. So I wish I could be there, but I'll be here in Oregon. And I am your host, Chris Cohen. I'm an advanced Cicerone and national BJCP beer judge. I'm the co-founder of the San Francisco Homebrewers Guild. I'm a former bar owner. I'm an attorney. I am a member of the bar of the great state of New York. I'm also the founder of Beer Scholar, and I've been doing beer education, and I've been training folks to crush the Cicerone exam since 2014. That's almost a decade of teaching about beer. It's bonkers. In honor of my friend, advanced Cicerone Chris Crow's nascent but trending movement, you must know about this. It's all over the place. If you're on the gram, and I'm embarrassed to use the term the gram, I'll probably be even more embarrassed in a year or two. I mean, I don't know. It's definitely not the latest, greatest social media platform at this point, right? But you must have seen on the gram people using the hashtag DrinkMoreDoppelbock. It's a whole movement. If you haven't seen it, I don't know how to explain that. You're probably just not on there. Everybody's doing it. They're drinking Doppelbock. You can buy one anytime. They're at the store. No one can stop you. They won't even try. You can just walk right in and get it. People are doing it. They're getting Doppelbock. They're taking pictures of it, and they're posting it on Instagram and wherever else, and they're using the hashtag DrinkMoreDoppelbock. It's a whole movement. It's huge. Millions of people are doing it. And you could do it too. Please tag me if you do. And tag my friend, Chris Crow. So I'm the Beer Scholar, shockingly. You may or may not know that. Chris Crow is fresh beer enthusiast. So please post your Doppelbocks, hashtag DrinkMoreDoppelbock, and tag me and Chris Crow. Doppelbock, it's a malt-focused amber brown lager. It's perfect for the winter season and for pairing with all the goodies that you're going to eat at, traditional American Thanksgivings and a lot of people's kind of traditional American Christmas dinners. So, in honor of all that, we'll be tasting and breaking down the Doppelbock style in this episode. It's a style that you should be able to find quite easily. It's around. Local craft breweries make it, but it's also just, it's all the good bottle shops have OG German versions, and it's on the syllabi for every level of the Cicerone program. It is a lovely dark lager that you need to know about. Not just for the exam, but for whenever you need a break from all those hops and all that bitterness and all those IPAs. Sometimes you just need a break. But this is the six pack, so we're going to talk about some other stuff too, starting with, let's see if I can get the right button here. Yes. All right, fans of interesting beer from all over the world are likely familiar with the Baltika brand. Baltika number 4 is listed in the BJCP guidelines as a commercial example of international dark lager, but the one more people are familiar with is Baltika number 6. Always found that numbering system to be like super annoying and confusing. But Baltika number 6 is listed as a commercial example in the BJCP guidelines of Baltic Porter. And it used to be pretty widely available in the U.S. You may or may not know why it's not anymore, but here's why. Baltika is a huge beer brand in Russia with around 8,400 employees across 8 different breweries. Until recently, Baltika was owned by the Carlsberg Group. Other brands owned by the Carlsberg Group include Kronenberg, 1664, Brooklyn, pretty big one here, and Somersby Cider, among many others. They own a bunch of different brands, breweries all over mainland Europe, including in many Eastern European countries. So they're definitely one of those breweries that is, consumed in Eastern Europe and Russia. I mean, they had breweries they have breweries, I don't think for Baltika, but for other brands, even in Ukraine. So, like many Western-based businesses, the Carlsberg Group came under pressure to leave Russia after Putin's brutal invasion of Ukraine began, remember, right when it started, and there was all this pressure to hey, McDonald's, how can you possibly, justify making money in Russia? Because they're evil, right? So, what did Carlsberg do? They did what any big company would do in their situation. You're not just going to walk away from billions of dollars of business. So they put Baltika up for sale. And Carlsberg claimed at that time that they had found a buyer and had even signed a deal. They hadn't completed the deal. But then Putin stepped in, literally, personally, and signed an order bringing Baltika under Russian government control because it was deemed to be an asset of a firm from an unfriendly, quote-unquote, unfriendly country. So basically, Putin just took over Baltika and gave control of it to his oligarch buddies, who are obviously cutting him in on the profits. This is just how this whole oligarch situation in Russia works. No one knows how much money Putin has. He is considered to easily be among the richest people on earth. Some recent estimates are that he has over $200 billion in personal assets. So anyway, he and his buddies, they got a multi-billion-dollar freebie when they grabbed up Baltika. You want to call it a breathtaking level of corruption, but it's Russia. I don't even know if breathtaking, the term, can apply. That's just Russia. It's crazy. I know I'm sitting here in the U.S. and I get news that isn't always positive about Russia, but I took Russian in college and I was interested in it. But the corruption there is just breathtaking. Anyway, Carlsberg at the time said that they refused to help make that Russian takeover of Baltika appear to be legit by signing any paperwork, because of course they kind of came to them and said hey, let's work out some kind of BS deal where, we're taking you over, but if we could paper it up and make it look legit, that'd be great for us. And they said no. Interestingly, and this is where, if you read between the lines of these articles about this situation, you kind of understand just how insane the corruption level is here. So most of Baltika's top management actually remained in place. And of course, presumably are now taking orders from whichever oligarch was put in charge of the company at this very high level. But the management of Baltika is already still there, right? Still there doing everything, just kind of sending the money to someone else, I guess. And of course, this is also a great opportunity for them to enrich themselves, right? So if that wasn't all crazy enough, though, the saga continues because the two top bosses, that all happened a year and a half ago, right? Because the invasion's 2 years old now, which is heartbreaking for Ukraine. But anyway, the top bosses were detained this week on accusations of fraud. Those top bosses at Baltika were detained. So fraud in Russia, who would have thunk it? Carlsberg representatives said that the allegations against the former Baltika CEO and top manager are fake and meant to justify the Russian government takeover. But I think, I'm just reading between the lines. I don't think you need to be a genius to come to this conclusion. I'm not a conspiracy theorist. I'm really not. The last election was not stolen. I'm sorry. I'm not a conspiracy theorist, These two guys who got arrested, Like, they were previously C-suite level employees of Carlsberg's Baltika. They had been working for the Russian state for like a year and a half or something. So, okay, maybe those guys are totally innocent and just are taking the fall for the sake of appearances. But really, I mean, let's make the more reasonable assumption here and guess that they were probably doing the same stuff that the Russian oligarchs were doing and stealing money from Baltika instead of sending it up the chain to like the capo. It's a crazy world. I don't know. I just thought that was so interesting. It's just crazy. I think at the top level of like giant corporations. I don't know. I don't know if this stuff is normal or not. Anyway, next up. All right. An article in Paste this week sums up the general feeling in the U.S. craft beer biz. The title of the piece is, "For many craft breweries, the apocalypse is now." And that's true. I think we're all feeling that, right? I keep seeing like every, Substack, everyone who like writes about beer, everyone who has a newsletter, everyone's just kind of like, it's the apocalypse, things are bad, we're all dying, and things really are rough out there, which is sort of amazing because I do recall that even in like 2016 or 2017, people were saying they could not believe how fast craft beer had grown. And you were already starting to see like some flatlining, right, of sales pre-COVID. And there was all this chatter about like the soon to arrive apocalypse that was going to come to the whole industry. And it never came to pass. I honestly was stunned that we kind of, the COVID pandemic hit and most breweries like found a way to survive. But now with the numbers never returning to pre-COVID levels, the bloodbath has really finally begun. So the tracking website Statista shows that nearly 350 breweries have closed in the last 12 months in the U.S. And the big question is, whether it's sort of churn and a similar number of new breweries are opening, or whether it's like an actual shrinking of the total numbers of craft breweries in the U.S. We will know in a few months what the numbers look like for the total of 2023. But the overall contention that the U.S. beer market is now finally a mature market. Well, that certainly feels like the case. I don't know. I had been saying that prior to now, but I have seen all these articles coming out now saying, okay, the beer market's finally mature. And that's because I believe it's the economist for the Brewers Association did a talk where he kept saying that exact thing, that, okay, now the industry is mature. There's no way that you can have an explosion in an industry like of growth the way that craft beer did if you have a mature industry, right? That can only happen in an industry that is ready for sort of disruption, where people are dissatisfied with it or some new product that comes to market that just changes everything. Super interesting. Once that happens, once an industry is disrupted, it will eventually come back down to earth and be a new mature industry until some other thing happens that disrupts it again. I think, yeah, super interesting. But the days of, the whole, I've been homebrewing for a couple of years and I've decided to open a commercial brewery, like those days are so long over. And I felt like once that happened, that's kind of when the industry was mature. Like you couldn't just BS it. You didn't have any runway. You had to show up on day one with great beer. That was sort of like the just the buy-in to table stakes. So anyway, that story has just been everywhere, and it seemed that actual like I've been homebrewing thing, that story's been everywhere, right? And it had like this authenticity vibe to it. But nowadays it feels like a brand story that basically points to like you're probably screwed if you if you don't have some badass pro brewer coming in on day one. Anyway, the point is this: go out and support your local breweries, because you don't know which ones are struggling until they post that post that says, it's with great sadness we have to make this announcement. Also, this is a shakeout. The breweries that kind of underperform and don't understand business side stuff and are poor at marketing and maybe just make like bad beer. Yeah. It's not going to be good for them. I don't really know. Like I feel hopeful though. I think that you're going to see a lot of great breweries rise from the ashes of some of the, all this equipment, all these breweries, all these spaces are becoming available. And yes, the market may shrink a little bit, but I think we're going to see a lot of new small breweries rise from the ashes of this supposed apocalypse. All right, enough about apocalypse. All right, in last week's six-pack, we broke down the old ale style. Well, that choice of style for that week, it was actually inspired by the release of a classic old ale in England called Gale's Prize Old Ale. It was released last week, or I guess now about 10 days ago, by London's Meantime Brewing in pretty limited quantities. And if anyone out there knows where I can find some in the States, please do let me know. I would really love to try this beer. So, Gale's Prize, it's just such an interesting story. It has a lineage dating back to 1923 when it was first brewed at Gale's brewery. But even then, that beer was a total blast from the past. It's a blend of freshly brewed beer and vatted ale, which vatted means that the beer has been aged, so it's developed all these age-related oxidation characteristics, including like sherry-like flavors, but in this case, and in the case of actual old beers that are vatted, it really meant that it was aged also with a mix of yeast, bacteria, and Brettanomyces for a final product that, from what I gather, is not unlike what you get from a Flanders Red Ale or an Oud Bruin type of ale. You're going to get some extra acidity from the bacteria. You're going to get a combo of like leathery phenols and bright esters from the Brettanomyces. And so, these old ales, like if you listened to last week's episode, you'll recall those old ales were actually what inspired the creation of Flanders Red, these British old ales. So Flanders, it's crazy to think about that Belgian sour ales were influenced by aged English beers. Brettanomyces translates to British fungus. That's where it was discovered, in aging British beer. So really interesting. So Gale's Brewing and its brands have been bought and sold over the years, but currently reside with Asahi, who inherited Gale's when they purchased Fuller's in 2019. One of the Fuller's breweries was called Dark Star, or maybe it still is Dark Star. I don't know if they're still around. They're in all these are all in the UK, except Asahi, of course. But Dark Star had been making Gale's Prize Old Ale in recent years, so they had kind of resurrected it a little bit. If you're interested in learning more about this beer and the process of making it, check out beer historian Martin Cornell's article about it in Good Beer Hunting, which is linked in the episode description. And if you're a home brewer and you want to make weird beer like this, I've linked an article in Brew Your Own by Jamil Zainasheff about how to make this beer. I just think it's so freaking cool that like some dude, Gale, presumably, in 1923 wanted to recreate a historical ale and did so. And now in 2023, we are, it's like this big cool thing and it's been revived. I just love that. We're today reviving things that have already been revived multiple times. I just think that's so cool. Anyway, Gale's Prize Old Ale. If any of you know where to get that in the States or want to mail me some, I would be stoked. All right, next. I don't know how big this has been on social media. Maybe you've already heard about this, but I just found out about this. Tesla has their own beer. Tesla, like the car company. It is literally called Cyber Beer. It comes in a horrific/amazing Cybertruck-inspired bottle. So I just heard about this. I think it's worth talking about, just in case you're unaware, because you really ought to see these bottles. It's so ridiculous. So I first read that they had come out in Europe a few months ago, but I think they're actually available in the US. I think you can just order them on Tesla's website. So I guess what these are 7% ABV pale lagers. They are calling it a fest beer, like an Oktoberfest style beer, but that's obviously like a pretty massive ABV. So 7% ABV pale lager, probably something more like Hellesbach. Apparently it was brewed and bottled in California by Buzz Rock Brewing Company. I don't know those guys. I lived in Northern California for quite a long time until just a couple years ago, but I'm not in SoCal that often, so I don't know Buzz Rock Brewing Company. But as I was sitting here like scripting this episode, I just thought, I should look this up, on some other websites. I always do that. I try to do a little research here. I wouldn't call myself a journalist. I'm not doing like brand new journalism necessarily at all, but I do feel like I need to, look things up, make sure they're legit before I start telling you all about them. So it looks like it's still available on Tesla's website. It's a limited edition set. Get this, $150 for two 11.2 ounce, 330 ml, whatever bottles. So two smallish bottles of beer plus two very angular mugs that are called Cybersteins. Oh man. I honestly, I kind of wish Elon Musk wasn't such like a creepy conspiracy theorist and anti-Semite, because I would love to buy this and just try the beer like live on a future episode of the Six Pack. I think it would be worth a laugh, but also, I'm not trying to like necessarily support Elon Musk. I don't know. What do you think? Would it be worth the laugh? Anyway, if I was in the market for a car these days, like, it'd be really difficult not to consider a Tesla. It's so annoying. Capitalism makes people do weird stuff. So on that note, Tesla has already sold out of its $50 cyber bottle opener. That's a real thing too, that people purchased and is now sold out, which is bananas. Oh, next up, we got this.
Let's talk about beer styles.
Let's talk about beer styles. All right. I mentioned that hashtag that's been blowing up on Instagram over the last few weeks. You've definitely seen it. Hashtag DrinkMoreDoppelbock. My buddy Advanced Cicerone, Chris Crow, he started that whole thing. I've done my fair share to boost the signal. I'm really trying to bring DrinkMoreDoppelbock to the people. And listen, do me a favor. I don't ask much of you. I really don't. But please do this for me. Whenever you have a Doppelbock, take a photo of it, post it with the hashtag DrinkMoreDoppelbock, tag me, the beer scholar, and my buddy Chris Crow, fresh beer enthusiast. So this week we're talking about Doppelbock. Doppelbock translates to English as double bock. So this is an extra strong bock type beer. Just like with double IPA and regular IPA, Doppelbock isn't necessarily actually double the strength of a Hellesbock or a Dunkelsbock, right? The whole double thing doesn't always mean double. It just means bigger. The history of the Doppelbock style is pretty fun. Bocks generally come from the northern German town of Einbeck. One theory about where the term Bock comes from is that it's sort of a bastardization of the Beck in the word Einbeck, in the name of the town, Einbeck, where Bocks come from. So it's also worth noting that Bock, the word in German, also sounds like the word in German for goat, which is why you often see goats on the labels of Bocks or Doppelbocks. I'm holding right now a Paulaner Salvator, and unfortunately, there are no goats on this beer that I can see. Let's see. I'm sure I must have other Doppelbocks here. Hold on one second. Let me just check. I'm gonna pause this for one moment. All right, I'm back. I just checked my other Doppelbocks. All I've got is an Ondex, which is kind of crazy. It turns out I drank my Corbinian, my Weihenstephaner Corbinian for Thanksgiving. I forgot that I did that. It paired perfectly with the stuffing and the gravy. So good. Anyway, Ondex does not have any goats on the label. I don't recall if Corbinian does, but anyway, okay. Let's get back to business here. You'll see a goat on a lot of Bock beers on the label. So anyway, Einbeck was one of the centers of brewing in Europe during the Middle Ages. There was lots of brewing happening in southern Germany as well, in the Bavarian region where Munich was, and of course still is today. But the Einbeck area in the north was closer to water. The Hanseatic League was up there. They were shipping beer all over the place, and the beers from Einbeck were considered some of the best, and they were getting shipped all over the place. Well, when the folks in southern Germany got their hands on some of these Einbecker beers, they really liked them, and they started to replicate them. We're talking early 1600s here. And they replicated some of those beers, but with their own twists, like, for instance, using lager yeast and lagering techniques, which were fairly new at the time. So they're taking these like darker beers and they're making them in their cold cellars. They're using lager yeast. They're just putting their own spin on it, right? They probably aren't wildly different. than the ones that were being made in Einbeck. So then, in 1627, some Franciscan monks from Paola, Italy, set up a cloister in Munich. And a few years later, in 1634, they began to brew there. They were making beer to consume during Lent, which is a Christian holiday, during which the truly hardcore may fast for up to 40 days, not eat food for 40 days. Wow. You gotta love your Lord for that. That's serious business. So thus there was this necessity for liquid bread, quote unquote. That is, you hear that term used all the time when people talk about Doppelbock. It's liquid bread. So the monks at Paulaner, they basically took the Bavarian spin on northern Germany's Bock beers and then made it stronger. So these Bock beers, these styles, they came from northern Germany. The folks in southern Germany really liked them, so they started making them with their own spin. And that probably was happening, who knows, like 1500s, right? Then in the early mid-1600s, these monks show up and they start brewing it, but they want something stronger. They want something that'll get them through Lent. And so they just boost it. They just make it extra strong. And they name it Salvator, which translates to Savior, which, they're celebrating Jesus Christ, their Savior, and also this beer as their Savior when they can't eat. So it's Salvator. Pretty cool. So the OG example of the Doppelbock style and what we're drinking today definitely is not going to be very similar to the original Salvator beer they were making like 400 years ago, right? We've obviously learned a lot about how to brew in that time. Just little things like what is yeast, yeah, for instance. Anyway, eventually, in the late 1800s, imitators making similar beers were also calling theirs Salvator, but the then owners of Paulaner, which had become a secular business at that point, because Napoleon Bonaparte showed up and privatized it, interestingly. And then it just got, sold to some private businessmen in the area. But all these other breweries started making this beer too, like a similar beer, and calling it Salvator. So the owner of Paulaner Brewing, who wasn't a monk, was just a business guy. He was pissed off, and he applied for a trademark, which he got. And so no one else was allowed to use the term Salvator anymore. So that's why all these other versions of Doppelbock have a name that ends with ATOR, right? Ator. So you've got like Eyinger Celebrator, Spaten Optimator, Trogs Troganator, and like so many others. I could have written a huge list, but I just thought that'd be enough for you to understand what I'm talking about. You've got a few weird ones out there like Weinstefaner's Corbinian. Not all of them have an ATOR at the end, but anytime you see a beer with ATOR at the end, you pretty much know that's a Doppelbock. And it may be like something where you just see that there's this dark beer that your local craft brewery made, but it just has a name that ends in ATOR. I don't know if you can hear that. Bunch of sirens going by. All right. There we go. But yeah, if your local craft brewery makes a beer, you don't know what it is, but it ends in ATOR, you know that it's a Doppelbock. All right. So let's talk about, actually, let's just pop this because I would like to be sipping it while we're talking here. As I said, drink more Doppelbock. Yeah, this is a good mug for a Doppelbock, I think. Got that German Stein kind of vibe to it. Yeah. Fairly pale. Salvator. We'll talk about that. All right, that's delicious. Okay, anyway, here's what the BJCP guidelines has down for Doppelbock's overall impression. Quote, a strong, rich, and very malty German lager that can have both pale and dark variants. The darker versions have more richly developed and deeper malt flavors, while the paler versions have slightly more hops and dryness. So to be clear, the vast majority of Doppelbocks that you'll find on the market will be of the darker variety. So let's, I'm mostly going to talk about darker Doppelbocks here. And we're going to start by talking about appearance. And I just want to point out that this is Salvator. This is the OG. I'm Got it in a Wayfinder mug here. But you can see this beer is amber. And that is still considered a dark Doppelbock, although a lot of them are darker. This one's actually fairly pale, and it's not even considered a pale Doppelbock. So just heads up on that. And so, yeah, let's talk about appearance first. When you pour a Doppelbock, you're going to have a beer that falls somewhere between like amber, which is a bit unusual. They're usually deeper brown, right? Which is more common. The BJCP says that more common dark versions are, quote, copper to dark brown in color, often with ruby highlights and an off-white head. They go on to describe the less common pale versions of Doppelbock as deep gold to light amber in color with a white head. The SRM range for the style is massive. It goes from 6 to 25 SRM. So 6 is that light amber. I mean, that is very light amber, almost like a deep gold. But 25 is a deep brown. So most Doppelbocks you're going to encounter are going to be in the realm of like copper with ruby highlights. That's pretty typical. But one thing that is interesting is that Salvatore, the most OG of Doppelbocks, is fairly pale for the style. And this beer is pretty much straight up amber. It isn't dark enough really to qualify as copper, I wouldn't say. I mean, you're looking at it. If you're watching the video, I'm holding it up. It doesn't really qualify as copper. I'd guess, it has an SRM of probably around like 14, maybe. Definitely somewhere in the like 12 to 15-ish range. Weihenstephaner, Corbinian, Eyinger Celebrator, on the other hand, these are much darker Doppelbocks. They'd be described as more like brown or garnet or copper with ruby highlights. They're near the upper SRM level for the style, I would guess, which I would guess they're in the lower 20s, SRM lower 20s. Again, this style can go all the way from SRM 6, which is a very light amber, to SRM 25, which is dark brown. So even Salvatore, which is amber, as I mentioned, is listed in the guidelines as a dark Doppelbock. So if Salvatore is considered dark, it is my contention that you aren't going to find many pale ones out there. They do have a little list of pale ones, and if you can find them, definitely try them, because they're rare. So, when we're talking appearance, color is the easy and obvious element of appearance. But what else is there to look at? So let's talk about other things. Let's talk about, first of all, clarity. In other words, how clear is this beer? For Doppelbock, the BJCP says you should have good clarity, quote unquote good, meaning there may be just the slightest touch of haze. But many examples are going to have what we call brilliant clarity, which is the term we use to describe a beer that is as clear as it could possibly be. Like you could read a newspaper through it. It's so clear. And when I hold this beer up against like my computer, I can totally see all the words right through it. So this Salvatore is darn near brilliantly clear. With darker beers, though, it can sometimes be difficult to determine their clarity, right? Because they're just so dark that when you hold them up to a light, you can't really see through them. But when you hold them up to that light, you begin to understand the difference between an actual opaque black beer and these dark brown or copper beers that have red highlights, because you can kind of catch a glimpse of the light going through the beer in these what we call highlights. So those beers are generally going to have really good clarity because you're seeing the light come through and it's showing up as ruby or garnet or red kind of highlights. So next up, there's the beer's head. So what color is that? For Doppelbock, it'll usually be off-white for a dark version, maybe white for a pale version. Is the head persistent? Does it have a bunch of like tight bubbles? Does it have a bunch of large bubbles? This is a mix of different kind of bubbles. These are all elements of appearance. For Doppelbock, you should see, quoting the BJCP here, large, creamy, persistent head. So ideally, it's a pretty dense head that lasts a while. There are a lot of things that affect a beer's head. I'll probably do a six-pack pod episode on head and foam at some point. I don't want to dig in on that too much. This beer, this Salvatore I just poured myself, has absolutely no head. And that is actually my experience with the Salvatore that I poured myself just the other day as well. I don't know if it's just because these are really old or what, but when I had recently a Corbinian from Weihenstephaner and an Eyinger Celebrator, both of which I've just had in the last couple days, huge fluffy heads, totally persistent. So I'm not sure what's going on with these Salvatores. I don't know if I just keep buying them from some old batch. I'm just not sure, but the foam on this beer is basically non-existent, but that's not normal. It should be large, creamy, and persistent. Some other appearance-related elements to consider. Does the beer's head leave lacing behind on the side of the glass as you drink it? When you swirl the beer, does it have legs like some high alcohol beverages do, such as wine or like barley wines, Doppelbock can be up there. That can be up to 10% ABV. So there is a chance you'll see some legs. And I definitely saw some legs when I can see some legs here. Well, barely. It just makes a sheet. This beer style can go up to 10%. Salvatore is 7.9, I believe. So, seeing some legs wouldn't be crazy. If you're having like a beast mode barley wine or a glass of wine with really high ABV levels, you can definitely see some legs. All right, so next up, let's take a sniff. This is the moment, when you take a sniff of this, it becomes totally clear that this is a very strongly malt-focused beer. And the BJCP says, indeed, very strong maltiness, possibly with light caramel notes and up to a moderate alcohol aroma. Virtually no hop aroma. So that's what it says in the BJCP about aroma for Doppelbock. You are, like I said, much more likely to encounter dark versions of Doppelbock. And for the aroma of those, the BJCP says specifically that you should notice, quote, significant rich Maillard products. That's browning. That's like not caramelization, but a different kind of browning, the kind of browning that happens to like a steak, right? There's not like a bunch of sugar all over your steak, but it still gets a brown crust on it, right? When you cook it right, properly. So significant rich Maillard products, deeply toasted malt, and possibly a slight chocolate-like aroma that should never be roasted or burnt. Moderately low dark fruit like plums, dark grapes, or fruit leather is allowable. All right. So now we're in the territory of a strong, dark, and malt-focused beer, right? But one that does not feature much, if any, roastiness. So if you'll recall, like last week, we discussed Old Ale, and it's kind of similar. It's quite dark generally, but it's not roasty. You can have a dark beer that's not roasty. The roasty malt is what makes a lot of stouts and porters black, and this beer just doesn't have that. Doesn't have that going on. So let's see what we get in Doppelbock when we give it a sniff. So I'm not gonna lie, I think it'd be real boring for you to like watch me sniff and swirl and sniff and sip and swirl and stare off into space for like multiple minutes while I sit here writing down descriptors and stuff like that. So I did open one of these beers a bit ago and did a little sensory on it before hitting the record button. Oh, and I also did a live Doppelbock tasting in my course for the Certified Cicerone exam with a bunch of my students just a few days ago. So me and a bunch of the enrolled students, we tasted Doppelbocks together. We broke down the style in great detail. And it'd be real cool if you joined us for those weekly live tastings and Q&As. We always pick a different style, and then we all get together, predetermined style. Everyone has like a month or more to go get all these beers. And then everyone shows up, and we'll all have different ones. Like, of course, with Doppelbock, a lot of us had Salvatore because that's one of the ones that you can always find. But there were a few people who had different things. I had a Salvatore. I also had a Celebrator. So I had one dark one that was a little paler, and we all talked about it. We all talked about what we were sensing. We talked about the whole style. We broke it all down. Super fun. And then there's also an open Q&A, of course, so everyone gets their questions answered. Anyway, you should totally join. You should sign up for my course. Do it. All right. So some of the aroma descriptors I wrote down for Eyinger Celebrator included caramel chew, or like kind of like a Werther's Original, if you're familiar with those caramel candies. I wrote down toasted pumpernickel bread. That one just really was the main aroma I was getting. Toasted pumpernickel bread. Fruit cake, which is all about that dark dried fruit. So we're talking about things like plums and figs and dates, right, in a fruit cake. And I also wrote down rum-soaked raisins. And I really love that one because it helps me communicate that I'm smelling some alcohol in here without using a totally generic descriptor like perfumey alcohol, right? Quote unquote perfumey alcohol. Like, alcohol is hard to describe in a way that is consumer friendly and sounds delicious, and is interesting. So, rum-soaked raisins, I think, does a great job here. But if you can come up with any kind of sort of alcohol-soaked something, and rum-soaked raisins kind of an easy one, is sort of a familiar one. But other times I've used other descriptors like something infused vodka or whatever, just to let the reader know that, hey, or the listener know, hey, I'm getting some booze on this as well as this fruit character or this spice character or whatever. So yeah, fun fact, if you didn't know, fruitcake We talk about it. A lot of people actually haven't had it much, if ever. But often the fruit that's used to make fruitcakes are soaked in brandy or some other alcohol. And so it not only adds flavor, but it also helps the cake last longer. Interesting, fun trivia there. The ABV level for Doppelbock can range from 7% ABV to 10% ABV. So 7 to 10% ABV. So this is a pretty big beer. And you are going to get some booziness, especially from the stronger ones. So some other decent descriptors, depending on which example you've got, could include like molasses or treacle or toffee, right? These dark sugars. A touch of chocolate or cocoa. You know, these beers are never roasty, but you'll often find just a light touch of these sorts of aromas and flavors, especially in the darker examples. You know, some people I've heard mention that they get a touch of like licorice aroma from certain examples. You can talk about any kind of bread that you're getting. We usually like these darker breads like pumpernickel or toasted breads. There's lots of good descriptors you can throw out there for this. So when you're assessing a beer's aroma or flavor, never forget to go down your list of beer ingredients and specifically look for aromas from each, because you will forget. You will forget to do this, like in an exam situation I'm talking about here. But, you know, anytime you're judging a beer or breaking it down, you should do this. So as you sniff your Doppelbock, you know, what are you getting? Any hop aroma? How about any yeast-driven aromas? Any fruity esters? Any spicy phenols? What about malt-driven aromas? Right? Sometimes it can be difficult to know exactly where an aroma or flavor is coming from, and other times it will be like super obvious. So with Doppelbock, the aromas and flavors are usually going to be pretty much all about the malt. This is a lager, so the whole point is for the yeast to get out of the way and allow the other ingredients, whether that's hops or malt. The point of making lagers, is typically to have like very little yeast flavor presence and to allow the hops or the malt to shine. And indeed, this Doppelbock has a very clean fermentation profile. Or I should say, all the Doppelbocks I've had over the last week, I've had a few, like I mentioned. Celebrator, Corbinian, Salvatore, very clean fermentation profile. You know, these aren't like estery, fruity ales, and they're certainly not like phenolic Belgian ales. So the fermentation on these is done at a low lager yeast temperature. So it's slower, it's more controlled. The yeast produce less flavor-active compounds as they grow and as they process sugars into ethanol and CO2. And then the beer is lagered after fermentation. So lagering is, as you know, simply a cold conditioning period during which the beer is held at a very low temperature, sometimes just above freezing, for anywhere from a few days to several weeks. Or for strong lagers like Doppelbock, the lagering process is often done for several months. And so what is the point of this? Well, during lagering, certain flavor-active compounds in the beer are processed by the yeast into less flavor-active compounds. So crazy enough, the lager yeast are still kind of active, even at these ridiculously low temperatures. You know, they're definitely moving in like slow motion at this point. And a lot of them have probably just flocked out, given up. But there's still some activity in there. Yeah, it's bonkers. An ale yeast they would just be gone. They're just done at these temperatures. But lager yeast will continue to do work. It's pretty impressive. What they're doing is processing some certain flavor-active compounds into less flavor-active compounds. That includes some of the off flavors that you have to learn for the certified cicerone exam, like acetaldehyde and diacetyl, among others. Some compounds simply precipitate out of the beer during the lagering period, so that's the case for something like proteins and tannins that are just like hanging out in the beer. They'll just precipitate out, so it doesn't really rely on the yeast actually processing anything. They literally just precipitate to the bottom of the tank, which, by the way, is one of the reasons that lagering tanks are often horizontal, because then there's less. It just doesn't take as long for all this stuff to settle out, because the tank is on its side. So also some residual sugars in the beer continue to be processed. A lot of the sulfur that's in the beer, which lager yeast is kind of notorious for making a little bit of sulfur. We're talking like burnt match kind of sulfur or like eggy kind of sulfur. Either or. A lot of that will basically volatilizes out. So, you'll read it written as like being scrubbed out or whatever, but really it's just kind of volatilizing out in the sense of, these are very volatile compounds. They want to kind of come out of solution and go up into the air. That's why you can smell them, because they're volatile. And so as there is still some CO2 production happening, because that yeast is still active in there, it will scrub some of that out. When that CO2 blows off a little bit, it will take a lot of that sulfur with it. So altogether, though, the lagering process helps make the yeast-driven aromas and flavors in a lagered beer less apparent in the final beer. And it also provides it with that smoother mouthfeel that we kind of associate with lagers. And, it's kind of hard to describe what these changes are. If you read around, you'll see people use words like, oh, it's smoother afterwards and stuff like that. It's not like ineffable necessary. It's not like an acid trip that's like ineffable. I just can't describe it. But it's, it is hard to describe. But the beer is going to have less yeast-driven characteristics. It's going to be a little smoother. It's going to be a little cleaner. Those are the kind of descriptors we use for describing lagering. I'll probably do a whole show on that one day. All right, let's talk about flavor, though. So now we're putting the beer in our mouths. We're bringing taste into the equation. You remember the 5 basic tastes, right? You can't smell those. You might smell things in a Doppelbock that give you the impression of sweetness, but you cannot smell sweetness. You have to put a beer in your mouth to detect sweetness. And so often the flavor delivers what the aroma promises, but there's often some differences. With the Eyinger Celebrator, I got a lot more of the dark dried fruit flavors in the flavor than I did in the aroma. So in the aroma, I could definitely detect some of that stuff, some of that fruitcakey stuff like dark cherry and figs, fruitcake. But my guess is that actually putting the beer in my mouth, bringing in the taste of sweetness, it kind of bends the overall flavor profile for me into the direction of being fruitier, right? So I think that's why I'm getting more of that dark dried fruit character in the flavor than I was getting in the aroma, which is kind of neat. So I don't get any hop flavor in, any of those Doppelbocks I've mentioned. I didn't get any hop flavor in them, and it may be because they're kind of old. It's quite possible, but it's generally, this isn't a beer style where you're going to get a lot of hop flavor, so that's pretty normal. I got no obvious yeast flavor there. These sort of dark dried fruit flavors, I mentioned before, sometimes it's hard to tell where a flavor is coming from, what exact ingredient's driving it. These dark dried fruit flavors, probably a little bit of an interplay between some yeast esters, but mostly it's the dark malt. I believe those dark dried fruit flavors are mostly driven by malt in every beer that they show up in. Of course, there are no yeast driven phenols in this beer, like I mentioned, like Belgian type phenols, those like peppery or spicy or clovey phenols, because it's not brewed with an ale yeast strain that is POF or PAD positive, which are the kind of yeast strains that make those phenols. So, those yeast strains are used to make beers like Weissbier or Saison or other Belgian ales. They're never used to make lagers. So now we can sense the primary taste of the beer. Now that we can taste that, we can check out the balance, right? You can't smell the balance. You have to put the beer in your mouth to get the balance. Most beers, not all beers, most beers are a balance of the sweet malt and the bitter hops, right? There are some sour ales where instead of bitterness, it's balanced by sourness. This is definitely not one of those beers. This beer is going to lean slightly sweet. The BJCP says, quote, most examples are fairly malty sweet on the palate, but should have an impression of attenuation in the finish. The impression of sweetness comes from low hopping, not from incomplete fermentation. Okay, so Doppelbock's IBU range is from 16 to 26 IBUs. So 16 to 26 IBUs is the IBU range, and as we know, knowing the IBU range of a beer doesn't tell you anything. It's literally useless knowledge without knowing a lot more about the beer. Because all that matters really is the beer's balance. I mean, for actually breaking down the flavor and the balance and all that stuff, right? I can tell you the IBU range of a beer, and it doesn't tell you squat. But knowing more about Doppelbock, knowing a lot more about Doppelbock, we know that it's a fairly strong beer, right? It's a 7 to 10% ABV beer. So 16 to 26 IBUs in a beer that big isn't a lot. So yeah, it's a malt-driven beer, and it typically leans slightly sweet. But it's not at all cloying or what we would call worty. Worty is sort of like what you would say about a beer that doesn't seem to have been fully fermented. It's sort of still, the thing that you get after the mash that you go to ferment, that's the wort, right? WORT. And if the fermentation just stalls out and you don't get a complete fermentation, that beer is going to be like super sweet. It's going to taste kind of worty. It won't be fully attenuated. The sweetness in Doppelbock is driven more by a low level of hop bitterness than it is by having lots of residual sugar still in the beer, right? So you've had beers that are really sweet, but maybe also really bitter, and they're still balanced. That's fine. You can do that. This beer is not really sweet. It leans slightly sweet, but that's largely, or at least partly, because it's just not very bitter. But it is fully attenuated. It's got a full enough attenuation that the Doppelbock, all the ones I've had recently, they have this pretty well-defined kind of cutoff in their finish, right? Yes, it's sweet. It comes across as sweet, but there's no like lingering sweetness or like lasting heaviness on your palate that would cause your palate to be fatigued after a few sips of this beer. That's not going to happen with these beers. They're pretty well attenuated. So now you can see we're kind of veering into talk about mouthfeel. So let's dig in on mouthfeel. So the BJCP says, quote, medium full to full body, moderate to moderately low carbonation, very smooth, without harshness or astringency. A light alcohol warmth may be noted, but it should never burn. So yeah, medium full is what you're going to get for the body for most Doppelbocks. Maybe when you're hitting that like high level, kind of 10% ABV level, you're going to get a full-bodied beer. And in fact, it's unfortunate the BJCP doesn't say this anymore. It used to say, okay, yes, this is a style that goes from 7 to 10%, but, and I'm going back to like, I don't know if this is the 2008 BJCP guidelines or the 2016. I just don't remember. I didn't look this up before the show. It's ridiculous that I remember all these things, but this is how long I've been doing this crap. It used to say, okay, sure, the style goes from 7 to 10% ABV, but there's actually no real upper limit on the ABV of Doppelbock. It used to say that straight up. And I think they were saying that because there are huge Doppelbocks out there. When we think of a Doppelbock that's huge, you might be thinking like, oh, Eisbock or something like that. But there are actually gigantic Doppelbocks out there, like Sammy Klaus, which is it used to be Austrian. It either was Swiss and is now brewed in Austria, or it was Austrian and is now brewed in Switzerland. I think it is brewed in Austria. It's a 14% alcohol. Basically, it's a Doppelbock. It's just a big, dark lager. In fact, it was for a long time the world's strongest production beer, I believe, and definitely was for a long time the world's strongest production lager. And if you don't know what I'm talking about, you've never had Sammy Klaus, you got to go to the beer store and find some Sammy Klaus, because it is kind of amazing. I love it. I have a whole bunch of them downstairs. They're all dated by year too, so it's definitely one of those beers you can cellar. Anyway, for our purposes, they go up to 10% ABV. A lot of Doppelbocks are going to provide a little alcohol warming in the mouth and the throat, right? Especially the bigger ones. Then they mention moderate to moderately low carbonation. So yeah, this isn't a zingy, tingly, high carbonation lager. This is a big, deeply malty lager that doesn't need lots of fizz. It's not, the body of this beer, it's not so dense that it's like a sipper, but it's also not a spritzy, like poolside summer crusher. So these mouthfeel elements of a beer, they're critical in thinking about why we like to drink certain beers or eat certain foods at various times of the year. I don't mind having a dark lager by the pool in the summer, but I want it to be a Schwarzbier, right? Which is more like a spritzy dark Pilsner. In the winter, I want a Bock or a Doppelbock or an Eisbock or a Baltic Porter, which is a lager, by the way, usually, almost always. These are all big, dark lagers. And that's not what I want to drink when I'm like sitting by the pool and it's 100 degrees out. All right, we're almost done. Let's finish this up by hitting on a few final items. What are Doppelbocks made from, and what are the important brewing techniques used to make them? So the BJCP says, quote, Pils, Vienna, and Munich malts, occasionally dark malt for color adjustment, traditional German hops, clean German lager yeast, decoction mashing is traditional. So yeah, Pilsner is the palest base malt, as you probably know. Vienna is a fairly dark base malt. And Munich is the darkest of the base malts. So a base malt is malted barley that contains enough enzymes to convert all of its own carbohydrates into sugars in the mash. So base malts are always, they're called base malts because they are the majority of every recipe. Specialty malts, these are malts that do not contain the enough enzymes to convert their sugars. And usually the reason is that they have been kilned or roasted in high heat or over a long period of time. And that's great for creating super flavorful malt, but it also denatures the enzymes in those malts so that you can't just make a beer with specialty malt, like all specialty malt, because it just won't, the mash won't really work. You won't get a bunch of sugar out of it, and your fermentation will be all whacked out. So all beer is mostly base malt with some specialty malt thrown in for flavor and color. That's how that works. And in the case of Doppelbock, the only specialty malt you'll find is sometimes a handful of roasted malt to give it, a little more depth of malt flavor, just to provide more depth to that malt flavor. And I think it's fair to say it's very likely that that is where the minor notes of chocolate or cocoa are coming from in those darker Doppelbocks that have those notes. That roasted malt's also going to darken the beer's color a bit. Let's see. The BJCP mentions traditional German hops. Those are going to be your typical continental noble type hops like Hallertau and the Gang. We already talked about that clean lager yeast. As for techniques, decoction mashing is traditional. So decoction mashing, it is the most intense type of mash. It's where the brewer removes about a third of the mash and boils it separately and then adds it back into the main mash. So this is usually done like 2 or 3 times, and it can take hours to do a proper triple decoction mash. You can do a double decoction, triple decoction. You could do a single decoction. And historically, this was done because brewers were making beer with poorly modified malt, under-modified malt. And I'm not going to dig in on that because it's kind of technical, but they would take the mash through a series of temperature steps to ensure that they were getting all the sugars they possibly could out of those malts. So it's kind of an efficiency thing. And, these days, malt modification is not a problem. Maltsters know exactly how to fully modify their malt. Back in the day, that wasn't the case. So a lot of brewers were getting malt and it was maybe not fully modified, which meant that when they brewed with it, it wasn't going to provide them with the amount of sugars they would want out of it. So they would take it through all these different steps in the mash. A few other historical reasons brewers did decoction include like acidifying the mash. You might do like an acid rest. You're stepping the mash, right? If you take out a third of the mash, boil it, and then put it back in, then the temperature of the main mash is going to rise. So you're taking it through a series of temperature steps, which are called rests. And one of them might have been like the acid rest if you needed to acidify your mash. But none of these reasons are really necessary today, right? They've all been solved. Like, you need to acidify your mash? Cool. Like, go buy a jug of lactic or phosphoric acid. Throw some in your mash or your brewing liquor before you even mash in. So, why would you do a decoction mash? Well, for flavor. Most of the world's top lager makers, pretty much across the board, say that they cannot reproduce the malt flavors they get from decoction by any other method. So a lot of brewers, you'll hear all these brewers say, and if you read like homebrew, homebrewers on Reddit or whatever, you'll see all these brewers saying like, why not just throw in this or that specialty malt and you can replicate those flavors, right? Because we've got all these specialty malts now that they didn't have back in the day. Like, just throw in a bunch of caramel malt and whatever and get those like malty flavors that you're looking for that you get from decoction. But I've never heard one of the world's top lager brewers say that ever. They swear by decoction. They say that they cannot get those flavors without doing decoction. So Wayfinder Brewing here in Portland, Oregon, one of the top lager makers in the U.S., they make a quadruple decocted Doppelbock as one of their seasonal releases. It's super good. And why would you do that? Well, it's all about, that's just a fun special project. That's like bordering on the ridiculous. But it's all about developing that depth of malt flavor. And there's also this thought that there's perhaps like a mouthfeel element to it, that it boosts mouthfeel slightly so that you can kind of fully attenuate that beer, but still get this weight or viscosity in that final beer that you desire. So finally, I kind of mentioned this at the top of the discussion, but let's do a quick style comparison. The BJCP says, quote, about Doppelbock, that it is a stronger, richer, more full-bodied version of either a Dunkelsbock or a Hellesbock. Dunkelsbock being a dark beer and Hellesbock being a pale beer. So basically, Doppelbock is a bigger version of a Dunkelsbock, right? Considering the fact that almost all of them are the dark version, Doppelbock is mostly a bigger Dunkelsbock. And Dunkelsbock, if you really want to dig in on that, is basically like a bigger version of a Munich Dunkel, all right? So you got Munich Dunkel, Dunkelsbock, and then Doppelbock. So it's basically like a ladder of these dark German lagers, each of which is stronger and more intensely malty than the last. And if you're talking about pale Doppelbocks, then you're talking about, Munich Helles, Hellesbock, and then a pale Doppelbock. So there are these two ladders in the German lager families that are just strength related. But the beers are generally have similar flavors. They just get bigger and more flavorful and more flavorful. So anyway, all of them are delicious. All those beers I just mentioned, all 3 styles, all 6 styles, you should go drink them. Go get a Doppelbock. Hashtag DrinkMoreDoppelbock. All right, number 6 this week. I'm just going to tell you about some music I dig that I like to work to. It is Ryan Celsius. I don't know if you ever heard of this guy. He's got a pretty popular YouTube channel. It's a pretty amazing channel, actually. If you're into like chill trap music, then he is your funk and chill wave overlord. Just search Ryan Celsius or click the link in this episode's description if you want to check him out. All right, folks, that is episode 3 of the Beer Scholar 6-Pack. If you enjoyed it, please subscribe and give it a thumbs up, 5 stars, and or a positive glowing review wherever you get your podcasts. But do it on YouTube. Go to YouTube, check out the whole video. Actually, I've got this monitor right here. You're like, why is he always looking off the side? Well, on one side, I've got like some script stuff. On the other, I've got a monitor, and I can see that the video is doing some weird choppy thing here. So I apologize for that. But yeah, please give it a thumbs up, subscribe, hit the little bell thing. Also, if you have a question for me about pretty much anything, please fire up your phone's voice recorder, record your question, and email the audio file to chris@thebeerscholar.com. I haven't done an office hours segment for episodes 2 or 3, but it'll come back. I do have some questions in the queue, but I would love to get your question. Anyway, thanks so much for listening. Your support means the world to me. See you next week.